This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. We are back as Colorado loosens up some of the restrictions about in-person business. We are doing a podcast in a socially distant way here at the Craft Beer and Brewing office this week with Ross Koenigs of New Belgium Brewing. You are the brewing innovation specialist. Welcome to the podcast, Ross.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
If you're a Craft Beer and Brewing reader, a couple years ago in our IPA issue, you may have remembered we talked to Ross about some of the research that he'd been doing on dry hopping and effectiveness. He is currently writing a book for the Brewers Association Brewers Publications on cannabis in beer.
Yeah.
And so we're going to talk about some using cannabis in beer. We're going to talk about dry hopping IPAs. We're going to talk about doing this at a larger scale, what he has learned through that innovation process. And I'm excited to be able to talk to you about that, Ross.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Cool.
I'm just happy to be out of the house.
We've got all the doors and windows open here in the office. I've thoroughly Lysoled everything. We've got copious amounts of hand sanitizer at the ready, and we are a distance apart, also with screens in front of our mouths in order to keep anything from flying. So we're going to do this in a healthy and sanitary way. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to this. Before we get started, nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D chillers. Innovative modular designs and no proprietary parts propel G&D ahead as the premier choice for your glycol chilling needs. Breweries you recognize like Russian River, Ninkasi, Jack's Abbey, Samuel Adams, and more trust G&D to chill the beer you love. Call G&D Chillers to discuss your project today or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, kickstart your innovation with Old Orchard Craft Juice Concentrates. Old Orchard knows that a strategic seasonal release calendar means higher margins, increased taproom traffic, and secured shelf space for your brand. That's why they collaborate with countless breweries on product development conversations year-round. With unique flavors like watermelon, rhubarb, pineapple, and plum, the possibilities are endless. Get your Old Orchard sample kit with free 6-pack cooler at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Definitely want to throw some thanks out to our sponsors for continuing to support this podcast through a difficult environment for everybody in the brewing world. Thanks for coming out and sitting down with me today, Ross.
Yeah.
Talk to me first a little bit about your arc through brewing, how you got where you are today, what got you interested, and how you ended up here at New Belgium. Give me the 3 to 4 minute history of Ross and brewing.
It's a long story. Really, I've been in the beer business literally my entire professional life. I got inspired to homebrew by my older brother. And he's a couple years older than me. I was still back in high school. He picked up a homebrewing kit in college, and I just happened to be visiting him down at his university. One weekend he was brewing a batch of beer, and I just thought it was just the coolest thing ever. That kind of spun me out. Where I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin originally, and so
There's no beer there.
No beer at all. But at the time, it was basically just there was Lakefront Brewing Company and Miller. We went and we had a family friend that ended up giving me my first job in the beer business, working as a merchandiser and basically an assistant, running beer around the city of Milwaukee on trucks for a distributor. And so that kind of got my foot in the door. At that point, I did, I've worked as a distributor sales rep, selling craft beer. I went out and did the UC Davis brewing program, so did a bit of education there, and then I started brewing from there. So I worked for a reasonably small craft brewery in Illinois called Two Brothers Brewing Company, and then ended up landing at New Belgium about 10 years ago. So started in the cellar, worked in the brew house, and now I've been in innovations for 6 or 7 years.
Cool.
So, yeah.
So as an innovation brewer, what's your primary focus? Is there a direction to this? Are you tasked with certain things?
Yes.
How much of it is self-directed and how much of it is business-directed?
It's a bit of both.
Okay.
So there's two of us. So basically, New Belgium really has put a lot of time and energy and capital just into innovation.
Sure.
So we built our pilot brewery in 2012. So only 2 years into when I started the business. But more or less, it kind of evolved a bit organically. First I was brought on mostly just to kind of help provide some actual brewing help. We were just cranking out so many beers out of the pilot brewery that one person just couldn't really do the job.
Sure.
And so from there, then it was really just a lot of encouragement and all that sort of good stuff from I was reporting to Grady Hull and Peter Buchard at the time, so they were just kind of encouraging us, really like, find what you're passionate about, find what you're really interested in, and start specializing in that.
Yeah.
So kind of had a natural split where I just was really interested in hoppy beers, figuring that sort of stuff out. So I kind of just started specializing in that and kind of just picked up the mantle and ran with it. So Cody Reif, who's our other innovation specialist, he does everything from fruit beers, he does a lot of lager work, stuff like that.
Okay.
He does some really cool work there as well. So we're a fairly small team, but we kind of have specialists that are kind of keeping their finger on the pulse of lots of different things that are going on in craft beer.
Sure. An innovation for a brewery the size of New Belgium is still an incredibly important thing. It tends to, a lot of work and then a lot of development and iteration until you can scale things to a point where it becomes a product that you then bring out into market. What's that process kind of look like for New Belgium?
Lengthy.
Sure.
So I think we've learned a lot through the years. I think it's we've started to adopt a lot of more kind of big business sort of mentality, just in terms of like project management, things like that. We have like dedicated people who literally are just like making
rather
sure
than
all
big
of the
business, let's call it discipline.
That's probably a nicer way to put it.
Discipline and organization.
Certainly I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but it's just as you get to a certain level of size and complexity in your organization, like you need people that are actually dedicated to making sure things function properly. Otherwise, now you have just hundreds of people running around like a chicken with their head cut off.
True. You're developing new products, and it's a little different than someone saying, "Hey, this is the beer that we just brewed, and it's in a tank, and we're gonna write the name down on the tap board and put it up, and tell our servers the day that it goes up what it is."
Yeah.
It's a little more complex when you are getting buy-ins, orders, and develop packaging, label approvals. Communicating that to reps across 50 states, and sure.
Yeah, I can't tell you the number of stories of like, some grocery chain somewhere on the East Coast has highly specific, I'm using air quotes, but regulations of what can go in and out of their beer.
Interesting.
And so, it's like trying to accommodate lots of different needs around there.
Right.
It's a lengthy and messy process. But anyway, getting back to your question about like, what does that look like? So, we kind of have this kind of like intake mechanism. Basically, it could be organically started by us in the brewing department.
Sure.
It could be just anyone in the company. They have an idea for a beer.
Right.
Or it could be, we also have, we have a marketing team that we work very close with that, beer and packaging and all that sort of stuff matches. So, anyone in that intake sort of feed presents an idea, that then gets presented to basically like, senior leadership, all those sorts of people that basically just kind of give it pass, thumbs up, thumbs down, then that basically kicks off the process into both into my world where the beer actually gets concepted out, and then you have like kind of the marketers, they start drawing up package types and all the graphics, all the needed stuff on the back end that needs to go. And so as we go through, basically we work through. We have kind of like a rough concept in our head, like, okay, this is what I want this to be. So, say it's, I want to do a new Hazy IPA that's going to be in the Voodoo Rotator series, and I want it to be nothing but Galaxy hops in it, which is Starship IPA right now. So we'll just use Starship as an example. Basically, I'll kind of play around with that. I'll make sure, I work with our purchasing manager and all that on the hop end that, make sure we can actually secure the raw materials. I brew in the beer, and so then we have like a group of all of our quality assurance people, brewing managers, stuff like that then we start looking at all the data that starts getting spit out on the back end. So, did we actually hit our ABV targets? Did we hit our apparent extract targets? Did we hit our bitterness targets? Like, what kind of flavors are we getting? So we start integrating our sensory program as well. And so then, like, as we start going there, we start kind of like picking little holes. It's just like, okay, well, we're brewing on a 10 hectoliter system, and we're fermenting in tanks of 2,000 hectoliters once we start getting to the big scale. So,
right.
So then it's just kind of like, all right, well, how did you do it here? And then kind of have like this very kind of dynamic conversation as to, how is this thing going to go when we actually scale it?
Yeah, scaling is a little more difficult than just, putting the numbers into your brewing software and
absolutely
and watching it go.
Or
how many small scale batches on your 10 hectoliter system might you brew before you feel like you've got something that you're ready to roll out?
I think that it varies.
Sure.
I think the most we've done is probably upwards of 25 or 30.
Oh, wow.
Honestly, that has far more to do with we can't agree with what the hell the beer actually is than it is. The beer that I'm referring to is Citradelic.
Yeah.
Basically, it was this weird argument. It's like, well, is it a fruity hoppy beer or is it a hoppy fruity beer? Like it just, madness in retrospect. But basically
that's hilarious. A couple weeks ago we had Lindsay Barr on the podcast. And it's so interesting to again, she came out of the New Belgium program and developed that sensory program. But thinking about beer as a definition of being so tied to language and whether the recipe and the sensory actually ties into that is a real thing for you all. And that kind of verbal, articulate definition of it is different than just the brewing specs. That is as important for you all.
Yeah. And big shout out to Lindsay too, because she was a very integral part of that process and helped kind of manage a lot of the craziness out of that, where it was, really at a certain point, I think you have so many different people with different opinions about what this beer would be. And, Citradelic really was kind of a response to grapefruit sculpin from Ballast Point. That was just taking over the goddamn world at that point. And so
way back then, so long ago in like 2016, right?
Yeah. It feels like an eternity ago. But I think it was credit to Lindsay in that process that helping to really shape the conversation internally and really help us identify that we're all using the same language, we're all describing the same things, and I think that really helped us get to a point where we can just have a little bit better internal discipline when we're talking about something. We're all talking about the same thing and not having some people with just wildly different expectations. So,
but 25 pilot batches,
just to get to Citradelic,
nail the recipe so that it matches people's verbal definition of it.
Oh man, that was a mess. But
I feel for you. Well, talk a little bit about some of that scaling process. That from a brewing perspective, that is fascinating to me. It is fascinating to think about trying to brew hazy, juicy Voodoo Ranger IPA in a 2,000 hectoliter tank. I think most commercial brewers and home brewers, even like trying to conceive of how you do that, would think that that's rather insane.
Definitely. So, just to give you an idea of, if we'll pick on juicy hazy IPAs for a second, normally how a pub brewer or even a relatively small brewer would do it is basically you weigh out your hops, you knock out your beer into your tank, you then get on a scissor lift or even a ladder or something like that, go up to the top of the tank, open it up, chuck your hops in, boom, you've dry hopped. Our tanks are a couple 100 feet tall. You need to go through like 2 different buildings even to get up and access the tank itself. And then even if you wanted to do that, you're generally throwing somewhere between 1 and 2 pallets worth of hops into your beer. So like, just
right.
as a physical act that it's just not going to work. So, so from that, I mean, we ended up having
there becomes
to do
a big difference in like 1 pound per gallon dry hopping versus 3 or 5. Then you start talking about just orders of magnitude of additional volumes.
Yes, exactly. And so, and then, been very well documented that, just especially when you're throwing mid-fermentation hops, like developing, juicy, hazy flavor profiles. Really what you're looking at is like, throwing all that dry hop material, you're creating a bunch of nucleation sites. You could potentially have like massive foam overs and all that sort of good stuff. So, I mean, even managing that in the application that we do, where basically we have kind of like a slurry tank where, we basically have a standpipe in the tank, circulate it so, everything is relatively reasonably homogeneous.
Right.
And then you move the beer over to kind of like a slurrying tank. You dose the hops in and then use the mixing. Even from that, you would normally assume, especially on a small batch, even just the amount of CO2 would normally lift and mix all of your hops into your tank.
Right.
Not so much when you're going up a couple of stories.
Sure.
It's
a lot of hydrostatic pressure.
Yes.
In a tank like that, and stuff always wants to settle down, right?
Absolutely. And so
how do you overcome that?
Mixing helps, but to be honest with you, we're still learning. I think we're, I think really what then you do is, you understand where your flavor profile is at on a very small scale, that's very observable, relatively repeatable. You kind of, it's a fairly known quantity. So you use that as really your basis of comparison. But then as you start getting into all these different processes, then it's really like you're leaning on mostly your analytical chemistry lab, but then also your sensory lab as well. That like, all right, as we're tracking all these batches, we can, kind of track a lot of the key analytes, especially within biotransformation, that then we can be like, all right, well, how efficient were we? And then, especially even during packaging runs, we can actually then see like, all right, at what point in the run are we seeing differing differing volatiles quantitatively that then we can helps give us some better just better insight to how well we're mixing, how well like this is actually contacting with one another. So we're constantly tinkering, we're constantly doing that knob turning
biotransformation analytes. You're going way over my head here,
Russ. Sure thing, man.
Talk so you are doing mid-fermentation dry hopping on these beers at that kind of scale.
We are.
And when you say biotransformation analytes, how do you define that, or how do you measure those?
So the best understood, there's really kind of like 3 classes. There's like the terpene classes, mostly like monoterpene alcohols, like linalool, geraniol, all that sort of good stuff that, they'll be directly metabolized by yeast and transformed into different compounds like beta-citronellol, stuff like that, alpha-terpenol, things like that. And so we can actually then measure, from knockout, we're carrying over, or at the beginning of dry hopping, we know relatively how much linalool or geraniol, stuff like that we're actually putting into our beer. And then at the end we have a lot of very talented chemists that can actually, look out. It's just like, oh, okay, here's your conversion rate over into alpha-terpenol or beta-citronellol or, whatever. It's, the chemistry gets a little complicated at a certain point because it's not necessarily like a complete conversion, and there's some other factors at play that then kind of show you how well you did. But it's at least like it's a leading indicator for a marker. So I think it's definitely worthwhile to pay attention to. And so then you
have this analytical background to say that biotransformation does have this effect.
Absolutely.
It's clearly worth you going through that kind of trouble through your fermentation process.
Absolutely.
Now I want to ask a few questions about that because we've talked to a lot of brewers where they know it happens and it's harder to define because they don't have that lab background.
Right.
But for you, are there specific hops or compounds that, and you are fermenting with a variation of London Ale 3 or something similar to that?
London Ale 3.
London Ale 3. Right,
So,
right.
we also, we do, so it's interesting, you can also, actually our house ale, just our California Ale, WLP 001, actually is a really awesome mid-fermentation dry hop yeast.
Really?
The problem is it, we've noticed this, interesting little quirk with it that it's a great flocculator, and so you just can't keep a haze in it. And so you can do bright juicy beer, but you can't do hazy juicy beer. So unfortunately it's kind of one of the big laments of my world and my life, where it's just like, man, you could honestly, I think California Ale's a better mid-fermentation dry hop yeast than even London 3. I think it makes better flavor. I think it's cleaner flavor. I think the hops express better, but it's not hazy, so consumers don't want to drink it. It's like, oh, you're killing me. Come on.
I would love to keep talking about that. Before we do that, this episode is brought to you by Hopsteiner, your premium hop supplier dedicated to delivering quality hops and hop products in every package. Visit hopsteiner.com for a complete list of offerings or select Shop Hops to start ordering today. Also, Fermentis is the obvious choice for beverage fermentation. They've provided the beer industry, from large and small breweries to home brewers, with the best fermentation yeasts since 2003. Their yeasts are easy to use. Just pitch your Fermentis yeast directly into your wort. No rehydration necessary. To learn more about how Fermentis can improve the quality of your fermentation and for the latest on their exciting new product releases, visit fermentis.com. So we were talking about analytes, and this is really fascinating to me because, obviously, if you're taking certain compounds and they are becoming other compounds in finished beer that are pleasant and enjoyable by drinkers and brewers, then want to go through this process. If you all, from an analytical perspective, have looked at what some of those changes are there some that are more pronounced than others? Are there certain hops that are strong in certain compounds that see more benefit from that versus others where, because they're heavy in other compounds, that doesn't have as much effect on them? Talk to me a little bit about it, looking at hop selection from that analytical point of view of how you're going to end up with what you want in a finished beer.
Yeah. So, I would really say there's kind of like three classes of compounds that you really could go out and try and look for. There's the terpene fraction, which is lengthy and messy and complicated. Definitely like things like linalool and geraniol, certainly very easy to kind of wrap your head around conceptually.
Sure.
Then the other things that, really start kind of getting more into that like je ne sais quoi sort of part of hops is, things like polyfunctional thiols. They're sulfur-based aromatics that can be flavor and aroma active at like the part per trillion level.
Okay.
Like very, very tiny amounts can make a really substantial impact into the flavor and aroma quality of your beer. So it's interesting. It's also very hard to measure. I've been trying to push for us to get the capability to do
GC,
it.
Right?
Yeah, and so right now, honestly, like most of the work is actually being sent out to a lab in France. That there's quite a few of us. I'm not familiar with any lab in the United States that's actually being able to measure these compounds right now, and mostly it comes out of wine production, like things like Sauvignon Blanc, stuff like that. That there are a lot of similarities in that regard. And then the other one is hop esters, things like isobutyric acid, stuff like that, that can actually be, esterified into, something that's a lot more pleasant. Let's put it that way. Something that doesn't smell like cheesy sweat socks all of a sudden turns into like, pineapple and stuff like that. So there's a couple of, there's interesting things like that that, we can kind of pick on and play with. And so, I think it's like, you think about something like a Citra, I would say Citra really in my mind is three big classes. You got like big linalool and geraniol fractions. And I think especially when people think like Citra as citrus, I think that really what they're picking on is not only the big linalool fraction that's certainly present in a lot of those mid-firm beers, but then also it gets biotransformed into beta-citronellol, which also has a very like citrusy sort of quality to it. So I think that's that's kind of that big fraction. And then it's the other one is the thiol fraction, which is mostly like 4-MMP. So, kind of that like catty black currant, but eventually then kind of turns into I guess it stays catty, but, definitely kind of brings that kind of like rounding tropical gooseberry, somewhat lychee sort of, even a little passion fruit sort of note to it.
Yeah.
And so I think like when we think about that, it's, sometimes it's easy, even when we're picking on our own beers, it's just like, well, we're seeing all this, but then it's, say, especially since like, polyfunctional thiols are highly volatile, especially when you're in large industrial type settings and big tanks and all that sort of good stuff, it can be very easy to volatilize those compounds. And so then it's just like, all right, you get a beer that's, mid-firmed with Citra, which we have a couple beers at this point now that are doing that. It's just like, some of them you can get them back. It's just like, well, where's the cattiness? Like, it's just, it doesn't feel like Citra to me. It's, and so, I think as we're getting more sophisticated and more, just get more reps under our belt doing that, I think we're getting better at understanding a lot of kind of the initial criteria that will set us up for success at big scale. But, it's still a learning process.
Sure. Are there other hops that you find undergo a particularly interesting transformation through that, that mid-fern hopping process?
Yeah. The other one... two that I'll pick on. Mosaic is another one. It's an easy one to pick on just because Mosaic's delicious and beautiful and all that. But it definitely goes from, I think it's if you don't mid-firm Mosaic, it has a really big monoterpene fraction, especially a big myrcene hit, and so it definitely tends to the myrcene and a lot of the other like just straight monoterpenes will kind of crowd out things, especially if like you dry hopped at the end of fermentation. All that alcohol solubility. Like if you throw Mosaic in the kettle and never in the dry hop, it'll still biotransform and be really nice and fruity. But if you throw it at the end of fermentation, especially off of yeast, all that sort of good stuff, like it's just gonna be kind of a myrcene bomb. So definitely a good one to throw mid-firm. But it just has that like berry and just like passion fruit juice. I mean, it's crazy. It's just like black currant city. It's awesome. But the one definitely super classic hop that most people tend to not think too much about is Chinook. That Chinook mid-firmed, especially especially if you can kind of select for it. It just shows up like straight pineapple juice. It's like, it is the craziest thing. We've gotten, in our hop selection practices, we've gotten to a point where we've actually narrowed down the Chinook that we like the best actually comes from the Treasure Valley in Idaho. So we generally work pretty close with quite a few Idaho growers out there, and also work with our brokers. So we're just like, anytime we're selecting hops, we're like, we better see Idaho Chinooks on the table. So it's kind of cool. Like you can get into those really kind of nuanced sort of things, but we just know that Idaho Chinooks are just like, it's pineapple juice. It's crazy. It's awesome. Like there's just something in the soil there that just makes them show up. Washington and Oregon Chinooks are great too, but we just happen to have a very strong preference for the Idahos.
That, it's always fascinating to kind of, get a grasp on these. And I love, and it's something that I've come back to over and over again in various conversations here on the podcast, of looking at these classic hops in a little bit of a different way and finding new ways to use them. Classic hops, noble hops, English hops, classic American sea hops. and it's fascinating to hear you talk about it in that kind of way, that in that specific application with mid fermentation, dry hopping, that it has that kind of effect. Let's talk a little bit about dry hopping volumes. This is something that you've done a lot of research on in terms of getting effectiveness out of this. Now, as we all know, putting a term like double dry hopped, triple dry hopped, or quadruple dry hopped on any kind of label means that consumers are doubly or triply or quadruply interested in that beer. It creates a new story for the brewery. It creates a new thing for people to check in on Untappd. I will not offer my opinions on the value of that, other than to say that certainly, people like to try new things, and this creates the idea of a new thing within a parameter and a brand that a lot of consumers are familiar with. And so it fits the way the beer is being marketed these days. Talk to me a little bit, but then you start getting into the actual volumes, and there are limits to the effectiveness of these kinds of things and unintended consequences. Talk to me a little bit about some of the research that you've done on these dry hopping volumes and and what you all have found.
So I guess I view the double dry hop phenomenon kind of in two sort of different buckets. There's definitely the one of like all of the fairly highly coveted, beers from, name the very hot brewer right now. They're all doing it. And, including, just plugging our own cellar club, we're starting to do double dry hop beers too,
That's true.
I think they're pretty damn good. So, it's,
I've had a couple. I can agree with you on that.
Thank you. Thank you. So, it's like, hey, even us, we can do this too. So it's, But anyway, I'm digressing. I think within the double dry hop phenomena, I think like there's that like consumer appeal piece where it's just mostly, you're just trying to hit like a level of saturation and intensity with hops that, I think if, especially for, a lot of the brewers that do this, I've had a couple tell me with a straight face that, I can totally tell the difference between 4 and 10 pounds per barrel of fucking dry hops. I'm just like, well, all right. I mean, aside from the fact that it's a little bit more intense, like I don't think you actually can. Like, there's certainly like there's a saturation curve, like where you're sitting on that curve, like you're heading out towards that asymptote. Like where you sit on it, like I don't know. I mean, I'll agree with you that you're probably a fraction or two of a percent, maybe more intense, but really at the end of it, it's also like, you're also
talking to a brewer that has a very heightened sense for these things because it's what they do every day.
Absolutely.
And so their ability to kind of find discrete and finite differences is generally much different and much more tuned than
for sure. And there's also, and so like I genuinely think it's a good thing, and the beers are awesome. So, I'm not like the results speak for themselves. It's they're popular for a reason. But, I think it's also, I guess what I would encourage to any pro brewers that are listening, it's just like, well, be mindful that, you're running a business here. Like, do you really need to throw in that 30 barrel batch an extra, I don't know, a couple 100 pounds of hops, like to basically get the same effect?
Sure.
I question that business practice where it's just like, okay, you could probably shave out a pretty significant amount of hops and still be just about as intense, or like adopt other practices. You could do mixing practices. You could do other things like that that are just better, like, overall just like getting better extraction out of your hops. Like I would encourage them to think about that pretty hard.
Right.
That, while it's impressive and sexy to put on a label like, yeah, we use 20 pounds of hops per barrel. It's like, all right, man, like great, good for you, but like, do you really need to? Like, is this really the place where we want to be going as a business?
So where does that asymptote start, for you all? Because, and we're talking about that point at which, the difference between, each additional pound starts to become, indecipherable or indistinguishable from each other.
Yeah. And so, So I apologize to all our brewers. We do things in metric, so I'm going to be giving things to you in metric. Pounds per barrel is just Greek to me. So
Sure.
But
Kilograms per hectoliter. Oh gosh.
Yeah, right. But we really start to see like the shape and the curve of the asymptote starting to form somewhere between like 300 and 600 grams per hectoliter.
Okay.
So I think that would probably be about
A pound is 400 grams, so you're between
okay.
Four-fifths of a pound,
something like that. Yeah. So that's kind of where the curve really starts shaping out, and then so as you go out, I mean, looking at the slope of that line, I think it's all diminishing returns. You're definitely getting more in solution, but it's certainly not like on a 1-to-1 basis. So I think that's kind of like where you're starting to break off, and so I think everyone at a certain point with that, if you're breaking that cap, I think there's good reasons to do that, but just understanding that that's kind of where the slope starts really kind of like really flattening off. So it's very, very diminishing returns. But I did want to plug, there's actually a new study out from the Shellhammer lab over at OSU. They released it, I think it was in the ASBC last year, something like that. But they were showing that actually they were working with Dr. Sharp over at Ninkasi. And they're actually showing that the double dry hop effect is actually very highly efficacious. That they did a study. So say basically they did a study where they took just for argument's sake 500 grams per hectoliter and dry hopped it just like that. And then they did another separate study where it's like, okay, we're going to dry hop 250 grams per hectoliter earlier, and then another 200, remove the hops, dry hop another 250 grams per hectoliter, and they have a indicator. It's the acronym's OHI, but overall hop aroma intensity. Mm-hmm. They actually found that the double dry hopping, just using smaller quantities, even though you're using the same amount of hops, you actually got greater hop aroma intensity than you did just off of the 500 grams per hectoliter.
So Vinny will require me to mention that is not double dry hopping. That is two-stage dry hopping.
Oh, that's fair.
It's two-stage dry hopping. I will defer to Vinny. No, we talked about that on the podcast with him, and and he loves to make they've been doing quote unquote double dry hopping, if you call it that. Is two-stage dry hopping since for a very long time for that same kind of reason.
Right.
And it is interesting. Obviously we have varying definitions about these kinds of things. So what double dry hopping is it 2 times the volume, 4 times the volume in one addition versus this kind of multi-stage dry hopping? But yes, so that is an interesting point.
And so I guess two thoughts on that. I think one, it is cool that at least showing that okay, at least getting down in the chemistry of it, as you're dry hopping and, recirculating and extracting hops, that lower quantities, just, knowing that extraction solubility at lower concentrations is more effective. You can actually drive more into solution by using that method. But then also, at a certain point, all due respect to Vinny, it's just if you're dry hopping at 2 kilos per hectoliter and now you're double dry hopping at 4 kilos per hectoliter because you're throwing 2 at 2 different things, it's kind of the same thing at a certain point. I mean, I will forever and always defer to Vinny, but I guess it's okay, yeah, if you're dry hopping, at lower quantities, I think the 2-stage probably works a little bit better, but it's still we're kind of talking about the same
thing. I will
thing.
Continue to let brewers call it whatever they want to call it in order for them to sell beer to consumers.
Fair enough.
This is it is more of an explanatory process for marketing purposes, because otherwise, really, no one asks a chef how much salt they put into a dish.
Right.
It's almost a ridiculous question at some point.
Yeah.
Really, is this the way that you intended to create this thing and deliver it to me as a consumer so that I enjoy this kind of level? It is strange, on some sort of objective level, that we talk about ingredient levels like this in terms of marketing to consumers. but I digress. It is what it is, and
Yeah.
it does. And if it helps, helps brewers communicate what those flavors are, those intensity levels are to consumers, and consumers are seeking out that kind of intensity in the beer, then it explains that to them. And in the same way that ABV explains, that kind of level of intensity, that IBUs kind of somewhat explain that kind of intensity, and so I get it. It's marketing. We'll just leave it at that. At some point though, you start putting all that additional matter into a beer, and it has a counterproductive, or has some ability to actually start pulling things out of the beer as you add that back into it. Have you all experienced that in New Belgium?
So, I mean, I think the biggest thing when you think about it is just like, okay, we've thrown now. We're mid-ferming, or even just regular dry hopping, even, any kind of dry hopping. We've now thrown a couple pallets worth of hops into a tank, and now you have green, sludgy concrete that you need to get back out.
Sure.
Honestly, I think that's one of the largest challenges that we face. I think it's, especially in the mid-firm application, and then it presents itself in two different ways. With us, we're having conversations right now, not to tip our hat where we're going at all, but, I think it's the flavor profiles at mid-fermentation dry hopping is just too alluring to ignore.
Sure.
And so, we're actually starting to, do some preliminary studies on, how could we potentially do Voodoo Ranger, our big flagship 150,000 barrel a year brand, either in a blended mid-firm application, a full mid-firm application, stuff like that. But then all of a sudden you're basically losing your entire, yeast harvest sources. So, I mean, it's just, there's a lot of different ways to solve that problem. And so I think it's just more like recognizing what the problems are, and especially encouraging smaller brewers, especially ones that are starting to scale, at a certain point, it's not all that good to just keep ditching your yeast with every batch, going to a Gen 0 yeast and just buying from that. Eventually, you want to scale up these brands, and you want to hit a greater and greater volume and actually deliver it to a greater number of people. You're going to have to solve that problem. And there's lots of different ways to do it, but pitch and dry yeast every time is not, at a certain scale, is just not cost effective for you. And it's really, it's a pain.
Right. You're talking about pallets of yeast then, too.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. And I also want to get into talking about a little bit about cannabis, since we've now been talking about all of these terpenes and other compounds that exist both in hops and cannabis. Seems like a natural segue. But first, Craft Beer and Brewing's All Access subscriptions give you a year of the print and digital editions of the magazine, plus access to our library of video courses, a special deep dive email only for All Access subscribers, premium content, and all access exclusive merchandise. Go to beerandbrewing.com and click on the subscribe button to join now. Also, this episode is brought to you by Brewers Publications, publishers of Small Brewery Finance by Maria Pearman, How to Brew by John Palmer, and Historical Brewing Techniques by Lars Marius Garshall. Established in 1986, Brewers Publications has published more than 50 books of enduring value for amateur and professional brewers alike. Visit brewerspublications.com to browse the complete catalog of books and ebooks. And coming soon to the Brewers Publications lineup will be a book from Ross right here.
Yeah. So the book is on cannabis and beer, which is interesting and exciting and kind of nerve-wracking. And, it's... I think there's some very natural parallels to the two topics. And I think it's also, really kind of the genesis of the book was kind of a natural extension out of our work on the Hemperor. That was an interesting beer that, really trying to be very forward thinking that as the, seemingly incessant march of legalization comes on, that more and more people are interested and exposed to cannabis in some way or another. And especially us being in Colorado, like we've been on the front end of it, so felt very very prescient for us to release a beer. Just looking at when I say cannabis, it's cannabis with a big C. We're not talking marijuana here. We're actually talking industrial hemp, which it's all the same plant. It's all the same species. There's nothing different from them. They are literally the only legal definition is just one is 0.3% THC or below, or one is above.
So talk to me a little bit about this Hemperor process. This was a fascinating one that I remember talking to folks over in the lab about a couple years ago.
Yeah.
You all went through an elaborate process of basically tearing down, cannabis, using your GC mass spec, trying to figure out what it was, what those ingredients were that gave it that kind of signature flavor, and then trying to figure out how you could construct and rebuild that using legal, similar naturally occurring, terpenes and whatnot that create those that specific kind of signature flavor, and do it in a legal way in a beer that could be sold, in 50 states, especially in some of those places where they're not quite as forward thinking as here in Colorado. Talk to me a little bit about that process and what you found through going through that.
Yeah. So, that process started in late 2014, early 2015, something like that. Very recent after, the Farm Bill in 2014 was passed, basically allowed for the first time since basically the Second World War, for industrial hemp to be cultivated mostly by research institutions, trying to get out in front of it. And so that had a lot of really interesting ramifications. And so, we were approached by a company which is now called New West Genetics, which is kind of an offshoot organization out of Colorado State University here in Fort Collins. And so more or less they were kind of like, they're just hanging out in the tap room one day, happened to run into Peter Buchart, and just like, hey, this might be interesting to you. And so like Peter grabbed me and a couple other people, and we all like piled into a car and like went over to the greenhouses and just started like rubbing and smelling their hemp. And it was like, it's kind of like this light bulb moment went off, just like, holy crap, this could be, we already understand terpenes and terpene solubility and all that sort of good stuff through our use of hops. And so this seemed like a really natural progression behind that. And so, that then, kind of started this kind of frantic thing. One, we needed to understand what the hell this was, and, whether or not people were putting weird pesticides on it and all, just like all the other stuff, just like, well, should we really put this in beer? Like this could end poorly for us. But, to our delight and surprise, the growing, the growing regulations around growing industrial hemp are actually quite stringent. Mostly, it was kind of at the time of the nascent CBD industry, where basically you're just taking all the flowers and all the vegetative matter and just extracting it under supercritical CO2. So, it was just kind of one of those that like, any pesticides, any other like gnarly stuff that you would have is just going to go straight into your CBD extract.
Right.
And so, functionally, like a lot of these growers are growing close to being under like organic specifications. And so like it actually was a pretty interesting and really high quality from a brewing value sort of thing, crop for us. Then kind of as we like picked all that apart and found that, it actually could work, then we're just like, all right, well, let's actually define this. And so that's where a lot of lab work started happening. Some of it we're able to bring into the brewery ourselves. But we're utilizing at the time a lot of labs, even hemp, while it was kind of legal, it's also, we reached out and we're in frequent contact with the TTB, just like, what can we legally do here? And so they were giving us guidance. And so we're, operating in compliance of their guidance. But, for the most part, they're saying like, well, you can't, like, you can put seeds and stems in there, but you can't put the flower. And we're kind of like, why? They're like, well, it could have THC in it. It's like, so I'm like, all right, hang on a second. Like, went home, homebrewed a batch, like put a bunch of buds in there, and then shipped it off to like a state certified lab. It's just like, tell me if there's THC in there, or even CBD for that matter.
Right.
And they came back, they're like, nope, non-detect. Didn't get a single thing. So just presented that back to the
because
TTB.
You did a cold side and it did not.
Yeah, exactly. And even though cannabinoids are ethanol soluble, but you have a beer at 6%, 7% alcohol by volume, like that's really not a very it's not going to be all that effectively soluble. So for all intents and purposes, it was basically like the terpenes went into the beer.
That's what THCA doesn't become THC until it's
decarboxylated. Yeah, so heating step basically.
Sure.
And so there's other ways to decarboxylate, but heat is the easiest way.
Sure,
so
sure.
we figured just keep it all on the cold side.
Yeah.
We're not going to have to mess around with any of that, all that. But basically, we went back to the TTB and just like, okay, no cannabinoids in solution. What do you think? They're like, yeah, we're gonna wait for the FDA. They're just like, fuck. And so basically, like, we kind of hit that point where we had already in a non-official capacity, we had proven the concept that we could potentially put cannabis in beer and make something that's really delicious. And so like we also then basically, while we were having the cannabinoid profile run, we're also like, well, can you give us the terpene profile as well, so we can actually like understand what's in solution here, what we should be targeting. And so the kind of going from there, that was really then where we started splitting. We started kind of diving deeper into whatever literature we could find on cannabis, using our own experiments and our own, we even, solicited the help of, there's actually a PhD, a guy by the name of Avery Gilbert in town here. He does a lot of work in the marijuana space, but all from a sensory perspective. So actually like going through and, a lot of our sensory people
Isn't it amazing that there are
and,
PhD scientists that are, specialize?
It's crazy.
I mean,
it's awesome.
What a world we live in.
What
now.
a country.
Yeah,
it's amazing. But yeah, so, I think as we got on, we just developed like a better and better lexicon, both from a sensory organoleptic perspective, and then also a from an analytical chemistry perspective. And so really we released the Hemperor basically with the TTB. We're just like, well, we want to release this beer, we have all of our ducks in a row, and they're just like, well, if you can do it with GRAS, GRAS is an acronym for generally recognized as safe sources, then
the irony of that term is just
I know it's insane. If you can do that, then we'll give you approval on the beer. And so basically then we had to, outsource the work to a flavor lab, basically saying here are all the compounds that we want in solution. This is how we want it concentrated. This is how we want it to look in finished beer. And they did a great job with it. And if you've had the Hemperor before, it tastes like weed.
It doesn't just taste like weed. You open the bottle or the can, and it poured into a glass, and instantly everyone within 30 feet of you knows what beer you just opened. It tends to overtake a room and, quickly dominate the aroma of everything around it.
So it's there was definitely a bit of when we did that at first, we had a couple of people question. It's just like, can we dial that down a little bit? Like, it's at a certain point, we kept going back and forth on it. It's just like, all right, we were the first nationally released cannabis beers. It's just like, if you're having that honor of doing such a thing and like being so far out in front of it, you better deliver the goods. I'd rather absolutely blow your hair back, as hopefully as the Hemperor continues to go on and we further iterate it, and we're still waiting for a ruling from the FDA whether or not we can just put still have the same proof. We've repeated the process, we've looked at it a bunch of different ways. We're like, nope, still no cannabinoids. Don't know what to tell you. Like,
I can only imagine what you do when you come up with double dry hemped Hemperor.
Oh man, it's gonna be awesome. Oh man, it's and then the other thing is just like just thinking about the possibilities of just like all these ridiculous names in the cannabis world. It's gonna be awesome. Like just naming these things and like having it's gonna be a blast. Hopefully, if the FDA rules in our favor. But anyway, so yeah, that was kind of the genesis of the Hemperor.
Sure,
And then really, I was approached by the Brewers Association about a year and a half ago, something like that, maybe a little bit longer. Basically asking like, hey, we're interested in putting out a book on this. Are you interested in doing it? And I've never written a book before. It's writing a book isn't all that hard, except most people choose not to write books. And, like it's it's a lot of work. It's a lot of time, but it's fun. It's a gratifying process. It's really, it's interesting to get in there, but it's just a long and arduous process.
Right.
So, And so really what the book is going to be, like it's, trying to take a very holistic perspective. It's very industrial hemp focused. There is, I do discuss marijuana to a degree, but actually there's going to be a complimentary book released with that. A lot of the book is just introducing brewers, and hopefully it will have some appeal outside of the brewing community, but mostly targeted towards brewers, like introducing them to what cannabis is, a bit of its history, definitely doing quite a bit of a deep dive just on kind of a lot of the technicals, kind of the actual, the biosynthetic pathways of producing cannabinoids and terpenes and stuff like that, which is really interesting, especially when, it's mostly, since hops and cannabis are botanical cousins, there's actually like pretty much the same biosynthetic pathways that are made, which is really interesting. So, I spent a lot of time kind of juxtaposing cannabis with hops in a way that would hopefully be interesting to brewers. But then, then it's kind of taking, we'll see how the legal team weighs in on it, but then kind of transitioning towards like giving brewers some really good tools to think about cannabis and how that could potentially play out for their breweries. There'll also be a lengthy section on how to do things in a legally compliant way. And for the love of God, brewers, if you are listening, do not put CBD in your beer yet. Like, just don't do it. I saw a thing the other day. Companies are now starting to get sued by the FTC. Like, granted, there's a bunch of different things. One, CBD is not federally compliant to be added to beer, so just don't do it. And, you also have a lot of people that, CBD companies, stuff like that, like, oh, yeah, CBD will cure the coronavirus. CBD will cure your cancer. Like, making very specific, like, functional claims that, for the most part, the FDA is treating CBD right now as a food supplement, or a nutritional supplement. And so, the second you start making functional claims, all of a sudden it becomes like a regulated drug in the way that, like doctors prescribe and everything like that. So that requires extra levels of compliance and all that sort of good stuff that none of these companies have. And
that no one in that sector wants, because
if CBD becomes a drug, then the CBD seltzers and stuff like that you're seeing, those are illegal instantly. Like, there's a reason, even like, you could even make an argument that, we'll still see what happens with CBD, but like, you don't see breweries putting aspirin in their beer or, ibuprofen or other stuff like that. Like, oh, hangover cure now. Like, no, that's, we can't do that.
Through your study and learning of these compounds that exist within cannabis and that impact and the way that they overlap with hops, you mentioned that it will help brewers also understand the way they use hops. Are there esters, terpenes, thiols, etc., that you have found through that research process that you think that all brewers should pay more attention to in all of their beers? Ooh, I mean, we've all got, most of us have this hops poster that will show you the hops and the, kind of show you how much oil of each of these things they focus on a few of the major, kinds of compounds in hops. Are beyond that kind of simplistic data, are there other compounds that you think that the brewers should be paying attention to?
So I think the short answer is yes. I think especially within,
and I knew with you there'd be a long answer also, which is good.
Yeah. It's I hope you guys like people that wax poetic.
No, it's great.
That's all you get out of me. But I think it's really like it's unexplored. I think just mostly in the flavor world, I think for good reason, but like all of those sulfur fractions. And so, polyfunctional thiols being a great one of those, but then also, there's a whole litany of different compounds within like the sulfur odorant sort of category. And so like, and, I think especially like when you think about cannabis, just like that kind of skunky sort of aroma, like you always need some degree of it just to be like, oh yeah, that's cannabis.
Right.
But, and so I'm still, the section of the book hasn't been written yet, so this is actually really good. You're gonna watch me like just kind of think about this in live raw form, but I think it's since there aren't all that many labs that can study it, but we know it's like powerfully flavor active.
Yeah.
So like all of these like very subpart per trillion fruity sulfur-based flavor compounds could be everything from like passion fruit to caddy to skunky to all that sort of good stuff. Like really is impactful in your beer. It's impactful in cannabis. It's impactful in hops.
Yeah.
And so I think more so than anything, like getting having brewers understand, especially from like a juicy hazy IPA perspective, especially knowing how volatile all of these compounds are. It's one of these things that I think needs to be further studied in a way. Hopefully I can provide something useful to brewers, but, just knowing that it's very complex and, the book will touch on it, but
Sure.
I'm not sure how well it's going to be able to actually cover it in depth. But, getting brewers, especially like, they want to have more shelf stable juicy hazy IPAs. I mean, it's a very prescient topic that mostly it's the thiols that degrade and oxidize over time. So I mean, I think part of that's just like a processing perspective of like how do you get good just overall like good brewing practices and minimize oxygen ingress into your beer in general, but then also like how do you stabilize these compounds that like that fresh juicy IPA just off the canning line is nothing short of bliss, but a month and a half in it's just like the fuck happened to this. So it's
Sure.
So I think it's
and you've mentioned that a couple of times, that how volatile these compounds are. In that brewing process, what have you found that helps decrease that volatility, that helps these not volatilize off and get blown off as yeast is producing CO2 and taking all of these flavors and compounds with it as it escapes the fermentation?
Oxygen control is, just one of the best way.
Sure.
So, I mean, I think it starts at dry hopping. So, I mean, I think even, I don't have hard data to back this up, but this is just my brewer experience here. But, even just the sheer fact of, like working in the pilot brewery, popping the top on the tank and chucking your hops in versus we actually do have kind of like a solubilizing mechanism where we can actually flood it with CO2, purge out all the oxygen, and then like actively recirc our beer through that. I see a noticeable difference. I see, especially amongst like thiol stability. So I think it starts at dry hopping. Certainly it's a especially with just throwing dry hops in the tank during an active fermentation, like it tends to be one of those practices where it's like, hey, you can kind of get away with throwing a bunch of oxygen in your beer because the yeast for the most part will take it up. But my gut feeling is that process is introducing a bunch of staling compounds and oxidative compounds that are doing all sorts of things to your beer. And I think it's probably one of the leading indicators why a lot of juicy hazy beers are not stable. But then, it's also then just oxygen control if you're pushing it over to a bright tank, can line, bottling line, just all the, kind of all the normal basics of it. And, unfortunately, I think, there's some really great canning technologies out there that I think are really vastly improving just overall, like, product quality on the back end. But, unfortunately, that technology is super expensive. And so, only some brewers get to see the benefit of that. And that sucks. And hopefully that'll change in the future. I think there's some new can lines out there that are starting to go very small scale, relatively affordable, and actually should be able to provide better TPO specs and just overall like CanDO specs than what a lot of kind of the classic technologies have been. And so that's awesome. That's super great to see. And so I think those are the most important things. Things that I think other things that you can think about. Spunding your tanks, is starting to become a lot more popular amongst brewers, especially
in beers outside of lagers, huh?
But I think it's an unexplored topic. But I mean, I think especially like just thinking about overall like thiol odorants are highly volatile anyway, so you're probably blowing a decent amount of them out of your tank. If you can actually put some top pressure on your tank, you might actually be able to keep more of that in solution. I have zero data to back that up, but it sounds right. So
with this impending CO2 shortage that we're all seeming to face right now, it might all make sense. Do you all do that? Does it have an impact on the finishing of fermentation and the yeast performance?
I think there's a couple of big watch-outs there, but definitely invest in the actual valves. Like, don't just cap your tank and stuff like that. We've done that, and to mixed results. Especially like when you're especially if you're thinking about like mid-firm dry hop beers where you're having hop creep, other stuff like that, where it's like, oh yeah, I'm good, I'm gonna finish at this point. I could all of a sudden you just start running through your fermentation, and all of a sudden you're overpressurizing your tank and doing all these other things that aren't super ideal. So invest in the tech. But I think it definitely, there are yeasts. It definitely stresses your yeast out. So be cognizant of that. Especially if you have the capability to measure things like acetaldehyde, certainly diacetyl, stuff like that. Like that's going to be to your benefit. I would say if you don't have those capabilities, you might want to consider not spunding your tanks. But if you do, definitely just watch out for those yeast stress factors. And, but it seems like directionally, at least just from totally anecdotal experience, like it seems like it really does a great job. So something to think about.
What is next on your innovation horizon? What are you excited about right now, outside of the topics like dry hopping and cannabis that we've already talked about?
So
are there hop varieties? Are there processes? Are there
so we are plugging. I'm wearing a sweatshirt of our friends over at John I. Haas. Thanks for the sweatshirt, guys. But they actually we were pretty instrumental in helping them out with their Incognito product, which is a kind of like a lossless kettle extract. Varietal specific, mostly focusing on Citra and Mosaic right now. I think they're doing Sabro and Equinaut and a couple other things. But they're also developing a complementary product, which they are, still is more in beta test, but basically the cold side equivalent of that. So how do you do something that's basically a true to type varietal specific lossless dry hopping product that you can throw whenever you want in mid fermentation and theoretically still be able to get your yeast back out. So that's like really,
and not
really
lose
cool
volume
stuff.
from the tank to vegetal matter, and
Yeah, you got products like Cryo and other stuff like that from YCH. Those products are great, but that only gets you kind of part of the way there. And so this is kind of like taking some of that thing to its logical conclusion. And so that's interesting. They're still actively developing that, but we're working with them, and we're actually plugging to our new one of our new products, Sour IPA, which is a blend of our golden sour beer from our world famous foeder forest, and then we just did basically like a hazy IPA with it, so 100% Citra, and then actually does feature a little bit of that product in there. So we're starting to kind of take it to a bigger scale and understand how that behaves and looks and all that sort of good stuff. So we're getting a little bit of a sneak peek. I'm sure other breweries are as well, but definitely super exciting, and should be something that brewers should be able to get their hands on in the next couple of years. So
let's talk about that sour IPA for a minute. I'm just fascinated by this because, typically speaking, you all make a lot of sour beer. Obviously, the market for that volume of sour beer is a little different now.
Definitely.
There was a point in New Belgium's history where the goal was to democratize sour beer and push it out at an inexpensive price point, and have $12 bottles of La Folie all over the country. And that was a beautiful moment. And then consumers said, "Oh, we don't want that anymore. The price doesn't matter to us. We want special, and we want fruit, and we want we want it to feel like a dramatic event when I open that for a friend, rather than this kind of democratizing of sour beer, which perfectly fine. Consumers will tell you what they want, even if you have a different idea for what it is. So now you have all this beer, a lot of sour beer, and I know the sour isn't really your part of the brewery. But being able to push that into something like Sour IPA and use that, but also use it, with that kind of depth of flavor that comes from the traditional souring process versus something like a quick sour, had to be an interesting one. Talk to me a little bit about that process and how you even envision the complementary hazy IPA component to work with the blending of that golden sour.
Well, I think kind of we've had enough other, really great examples of the style. I mean, it's certainly kind of in its infancy, but, it all sorts throughout the country. So, we've definitely seen, very, very well done examples of the style. So I think that gave us a bit of a good guiding light. But I think at a certain point, then it's also just like conceptually, we're just like, all right, so you have juicy IPA that's supposed to taste like fruit juice, right? What's the other component of fruit juice that really doesn't deliver? It's the acid, and it's really something that acid in with any kind of fruit juice. It's just like you have aromatics, you have water, you have sugar, and you have acid, and like all those work very synergistically then to deliver that sort of thing. And so we, kind of within that, we're just like, all right, that's being kind of our guiding light of just like, all right, if we're bringing the juice, what we should probably bring the acid. And so that was kind of like the initial conversation of where things needed to go. I think fairly early on we realized that like just doing basically a single hop Citra, just juicy IPA, you don't really see that from New Belgium, so it's just kind of like, we should probably do that. Like damn near everybody else does. Let's show our chops. Let's see what's up. So that was, we coalesced around that idea fairly well. But then we're also like wanting to be highly cognizant that we also have a very established example of the style in a somewhat different way in Le Terroir, just a 100% golden sour that's been dry hopped, that we definitely didn't want to just be like Le Terroir light. We want to really kind of stand on its own legs, have its own unique personality, live in the world in a very different way than Le Terroir does.
And Le Terroir, when you taste that level of acidity and that kind of pH, And Le Terroir is one of my favorite beers in the world. It has been. I've written about it before. It's been on my year-end best of beer lists. That kind of level of pH and total acidity has a very dramatic effect on how those hops, are conveyed.
Yeah.
And so it tends to push all, that Amarillo, I believe, is Le Terroir, pushes it in a very specific direction that tastes like that hop at that acidity level.
Yeah.
And will certainly kind of change that orange fruitiness of something like Citra into more of a lemon lime kind of, citrusy with a little more of a sharp edge. So talk to me a little bit about kind of figuring out how to balance that piece so that the Hazy IPA still captures, more of, that kind of citrus character that you're looking for.
Yeah. It's exactly to your point. It's we wanted it to be a hazy IPA that happens to be sour, not sour hazy IPA.
Right,
it's a little semantic, but with sour IPA, wanting it to be that hazy IPA that happened to be sour. It was we actually had a lot of learnings, not only through dry hopping Le Terroir, but then also relatively back in New Belgium's history, we did do a dry hopped kettle sour IPA called Hop Tart back in our, that was probably 2013, 2014, something like that. But one of the real key learnings that we notice in that beer is that even if you introduce hops, and again, we don't understand it fully, but we know it's a real thing. If you introduce hops into a low pH environment, they tend to extract and express in a very different way than if you develop the IPA that you want and then introduce the sour beer. Not exactly sure how it works, but it's a real thing. And so,
I guess that lets you dial the acidity, the total amount of acid and the pH into, I can see how you could get it exactly where you want it, and versus a process of traditional sour, which is more driven by where the culture wants to take that level of acidity.
Definitely, so the control factor is key, but then we tried it both ways. That we just kind of introduced the we just blended it in when we were ready to dry hop, and just kind of that would be easier. And then it's just this doesn't taste like Citra anymore. It still tasted good, it's still, but it tended to have a bit more of that kind of Le Terroir light sort of flavor profile to it. So that was a really critical insight that just build the IPA that you want and get the flavors right, and then introduce the sour, and they tend to the flavor tends to get a little less squirrely. I mean, certainly there's some aging and maturation sort of characteristics that somewhat get applied to it, but it really does it lets the juicy IPA stand a little bit better. It just tends to be a bit cleaner and clearer of an expression of the hop, along with the sour, than necessarily doing it all where it just tends to have that really kind of it's a it's just kind of that muddled sour hoppy, and it's delicious and great, but it's just when you already have a product in Le Terroir that has that very specific flavor profile, it's well, let's give them something different.
Obviously with any kind of hazy IPA, that residual sweetness is creates body, and it helps heighten those citrus flavors. But if you have that much residual sweetness in a beer that where you now put a sour culture into it, those sour cultures, bread, etc., they'll just eat that sugar, and do you go through a pasteurization process before you do that, just to
we do just that's just an unacceptable variable
for sure.
Le Terroir is live, and we do a lot of things to really manage for that
for sure.
There's certainly already the dry hop creep factor of it. We bottle condition it, which actually helps kind of reduce that total real extract in the package there, which which is good. But then we also just expect it that, like, yeah, it's going to be kind of squirrely and unruly and kind of does what it wants to do. And that's great.
Hops creeping literally. I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah.
How long does that take to kind of bottle condition and clean up?
About 5 weeks.
5 weeks, okay.
Yeah, so, we dry hop it. Lauren could speak to it far better than I can, but, we dry hop it mostly on whole cone hops.
Yeah.
There's reasons for that escape me at this point. But, then I think we kind of let that sit at, relatively just kind of normal foeder temperature, all that sort of good stuff. So I think, even within that, I think the Brett, kind of gets a first crack at a little bit of the sugar. Yeah. And then we'll introduce the sugar, bottle condition it, and then we'll condition it for around 5 weeks, potentially longer. I mean, we're just we're looking for diacetyl reduction, all the classic stuff. But that tends to get a lot of the hop creep out of there, or at least like all the sugars that the hops have now made will clean up fairly nicely. There's still, we definitely see a little bit of extra attenuation even in the package after that. But for the most part, we're getting down to a level where there's just not that much more sugar to eat.
It's pretty dry before it goes in there. Sure. Well, Ross Koenigs, thanks for joining me on this episode of the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie.
Nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D Chillers. Old Orchard are the industry's juice blending experts. Hopsteiner is your premium supplier for quality hops and hops products. Fermentist yeasts are the obvious choice. Brewers Publications has published more than 50 books for amateur and pro brewers. And Craft Beer and Brewing's All Access subscriptions are the best way to support this very podcast. I would normally ask where people can find you, but it's New Belgium. You can pretty much find them everywhere.
Yeah.
What's one or two beers, new beers that you've had a hand in making that everyone should go out there and try?
So if it's Voodoo Ranger, I have my hand in it. So the Voodoo Ranger portfolio. And then if you can get your hands on our Sour IPA, it is very worth checking out. It's an awesome beer.
Cool. Well, Ross Koenigs, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks so much.
Yeah,
really
cheers.
Appreciate it. Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.